Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Vicente Sederberg Cannabis and Psychedelic Reform Post-Election and Executive Scheduling webinar. I'm going to wait for a little bit as additional people are coming in, but there's been a lot to process over the last 48 hours or so. And I feel like it's a little bit of deja vu sometimes. We don't necessarily know who is the winner of all of these races, but thankfully, at least for the ones that we'll be talking about when it comes to cannabis reform and psychedelics in Colorado, we do have results. So that is for certain. Although some of the slides I'll be chatting about for who is going to control the House is a little bit unknown. So thanks, everyone. And I'm going to wait probably another minute or so to allow for more people to join. I hope everyone had a good election day, regardless of whether or not you celebrated at a cannabis watch party or in your own house with computer screens and TV monitors up yelling at things. I had a great time sitting there at the psychedelic reform, crunching numbers and seeing how things were projected. And it always feels good when you can accurately call an election before anyone else does. So talk a little bit about where things are going both in cannabis nationally as well as with psychedelic reform throughout this webinar. All right, I see some more people continue to trickle in. I'm going to start, and if people join, you may just miss little bits here and there of the introductions. So again, thank you everyone for joining. This is kind of the second in our series of the ballots and the elections. We had a little bit of a preview last week on what might pass, and this is our synopsis afterwards. So we've got our cannabis and psychedelics reform, the post-election analysis, and also we're going to be talking a little bit here about the executive scheduling, right? So we may or may not have a divided government, and so what will happen in the meantime? So I'll introduce myself and then let my colleagues introduce themselves. So my name's Andrew Livingston. I'm the Director of Economics and Research at the law firm Vicente Sederberg. I am one of your resident number crunchers and all-around cannabis nerds, and I'll be moderating for today, talking about what we do and do not know. But first, I'm going to let my colleague Yolanda introduce herself.
Hey guys, Yolanda Clarke here at Vicente Sederberg. I'm a senior associate working in licensing and regulatory space. So we assist clients looking to operate in new and emerging markets. And so I'm really excited to talk to you about some new opportunities in light of this week's election.
Thanks so much, Yolanda. Josh.
Andrew, thanks so much for moderating. I know I moderated the last one, but I'm excited to pass the mic over to you. I feel like you're a lot more entertaining than I am, and appreciate that. And knowledgeable, I'd say. But hey, so everyone, thank you for joining us. I'm one of the founding partners at Vicente Sederberg. I also run our psychedelics practice, and I'm the chair of the Natural Medicine Colorado, which is making history over the last few days here. And I'm super excited to talk about that.
Great. Thank you, Josh. I appreciate it. Shane Pennington.
Hey, everybody. I'm Shane Pennington. I'm counsel at Vicente Sederberg in the New York office. I work from a house in Beacon, New York in the Hudson Valley, and I concentrate on federal regulatory stuff, which often means I'm suing the DEA and or helping clients get licensed to handle controlled substances by the DEA.
Thanks, Shane. Great. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to be covering today. So this is really an overview that focuses both on what's happening at the federal level and also what's happening at the state level. So how is changing Congress going to affect cannabis policy? So when we wrote this presentation, I assumed, like many of the pollsters, that the Republicans were going to take the House and probably the Senate. But the red wave wasn't quite as much as a red wave as it was a small little tidal movement. I don't know, maybe. So even if we do or do not have split Congress and a split government, we'll have something that will likely move forward, and that's the executive scheduling that Biden kicked off a number of weeks ago. And Shane, one of the top experts in this across the country and across the world, is going to be talking about this process for executive scheduling and what to expect. We're also going to be diving into the changes at the state legislative level. So not just what passed and didn't pass when it comes to cannabis ballot initiatives, but also how state legislative movements in different state houses could affect the likelihood of legalization through the legislative process in 2023. We're going to be talking about new business opportunities, what it looks like for licensing, as well as market sizes and how businesses can prepare. And then Josh is going to be giving some really good details on what to expect from the wonderful passage of Prop 122, the Natural Medicine Act in Colorado, and how this implementation is going to roll out. So really excited for this. So first, let's talk a second about what the landscape looked like earlier in the week, right? So we had ballots, just adult use, actually. This was, I think, one of the first years where there wasn't any medical marijuana ballot initiatives. Those had tried but failed to get on the ballot in Idaho, Wyoming, and Nebraska. But we did have ballot initiatives in North Dakota, South Dakota, Missouri, Arkansas, and Maryland. And, they tried but failed in Ohio, Oklahoma, and Florida to get on the ballot. So I'll be talking about what we might expect on that in the future. So out of that 5, North Dakota, South Dakota, Missouri, Arkansas, and Maryland, it was a mixed bag. So if you can go to the next slide, Jim. It was definitely a mixed bag. This was probably one of the first years that I can remember in a while in which on at least the cannabis ballot initiatives, we had more losses than wins. Granted, it is a midterm. There was definitely funding issues for a number of these ballots, particularly in North and South Dakota. So there were challenges there. And in Arkansas, the way the initiative was written split some of the advocacy community. There were, not everyone in Arkansas who was in favor of legalization voted in favor of the amendment there. And further than that, the entire Republican leadership really came out strong against. So we had some losses, but we did have some significant wins, both in Maryland and Missouri. And we'll be talking about those in greater detail, what those mean, what to expect. Yolanda will be detailing that. Maryland, don't really quite know exactly what it's going to look like, and that will be a real decision in the 2023 legislative session in Maryland. But in Missouri, we have a lot of details, and we pretty much know almost exactly how this is going to roll out. We'll likely see stores open in early 2023. But another successful win, right? So while we did have some losses, we also had some major wins. And Colorado, successful psychedelic initiative. Josh will be talking about Proposition 122, which was called yesterday, although when we were looking at it, we were pretty confident it was going to win that night. So there's that. And then another thing, oh, sweet, I see a thumbs up rolling in. And so let's also, we'll also talk about what we might see in the future. So Ohio, Oklahoma, and Florida will likely have in 2023 or 2024 adult use initiative. Oklahoma is going to be in the spring of 2023. It got enough signatures to get on the ballot for this last election, but there was some shenanigans in how long it took to get processed and some back and forth, some lawsuits that went up to the state Supreme Court. And so while it did make the ballot in November, it will make the ballot in the spring. Similar sort of thing, although it's even more complicated, we'll get into it. In Ohio, we'll likely see an adult use initiative in Ohio in 2023, probably most likely in the fall. And then Florida, constantly trying to gather signatures. It's a big lift in Florida, and it needs 60% to pass. So it's difficult to pass, but we'll likely see that in 2024. There's been some issues in previous years about getting a ballot title and ballot summary that the Florida Supreme Court will approve. That's for another webinar. And then finally, we'll be chatting a little bit about what we might see in state legislatures. So most exciting is probably Minnesota, which I don't think I've ever said as a sentence before. The most exciting next things is Minnesota, but it's really cool. They've got a Democratic trifecta there as the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, which is the Democrats in Minnesota, swept into the Senate, which is great. And then Hawaii with the new governor, we might need to see some changes. So that's a quick little synopsis of what we will be talking about going forward. All right, so let's get into the meat a little bit. What do these measures mean for the growth of the state and the national cannabis markets? When and where and how will new cannabis licenses be issued? So this is the question, right? Everyone's looking at, okay, an election happened. How can I identify new business opportunities? I might be a new entrepreneur. I might be an existing business looking to expand. So in Maryland, the number of new businesses and opportunities will depend on what the legislature will pass in 2023. So for those of you who watched our previous webinar, and Yolanda will be talking about this in greater detail for Maryland, Maryland was a legislatively referred constitutional amendment. So the legislature, similar to what happened in New Jersey a number of years ago, rather than passing the law themselves, kicked it to voters. Now, voters decided, yes, we do want to legalize cannabis. There is a little bit of an implementation law that was passed last year that will just, make certain possessions legal, also do some social equity, some expungement, things like that. But as far as the nitty-gritty on business licensing, that is for this next legislative session. Maryland also became a trifecta democratically held state, a switch from a Republican governor to a Democratic governor. And so there will be a real focus on social equity, which Yolanda, Maryland resident, and one of our Maryland experts can really talk about in greater detail. So there will be new licenses there. How those roll out, when they roll out, and how existing medical operators transition in this environment is to be determined. Let's also talk about Missouri and the limits on the number of new licenses. So Missouri, a voter-initiated constitutional amendment, so signatures were collected as a normal ballot initiative. And what we will see, this was an initiative that was written by the existing medical operators, and it does favor them considerably. So they'll be able to open first, likely in early 2023, as they have the automatic ability to do that. And essentially they can apply right after the ballot is certified and it becomes effective. And then if it's not approved or anything within 60 days, they're able to pretty much open. There's then a new microbusiness license, which is issued within about a year or so, the effective date. So we'll see these microbusinesses come around, but as Yolanda, we'll talk about these. The business opportunities there are going to be a little bit more limited, given it's two separate parallel systems. The microbusinesses can't sell to the comprehensive facilities, and those comprehensive facilities are only going to be the existing medical operators for about the first year and a half. Well, next slide. Josh, you want to jump on what we are going to see for national psychedelic market?
Yeah, so super exciting. For those that don't know, really, Prop 122 is a historic measure that creates access to natural psychedelic experiences and therapies while also decriminalizing personal use. And this measure, as we speak right now, it's been called. The campaign and the opponents of the campaign have called victory here. It hasn't been officially called from the AP yet, but it should be. And one thing I would note too is that there's still a lot of Denver votes out there, and we expect a lot of those to break our way. So what this will actually do, even though right now it's like everyone's saying, hey, it was a nail biter, it was slim, we do expect the numbers and the margins to go up substantially. And when you look at this measure in light of the fact that it's a midterm election year and not a presidential election year, and sort of like what the turnout is, this is a pretty good victory. So what you can expect there, here in Colorado is, like our lead's going to grow at some point, whenever Denver gets around to counting, the other 50% of the votes that they haven't counted yet. We'll likely see the election officially called by the AP or the Denver Post. But what does this mean? Just like putting this, taking a step back, right now there is no state-based psychedelic model except for Oregon. And what this does and what this measure proves is that there's a political appetite and there's a will and that there's a need for more state-based models around access to natural psychedelics. And when I look at big picture, I see sort of like 4 paths to access around psychedelics. And here at VS, we support all of them. One is a federal pharmaceutical medicalization approach. That's one path. There's benefits around insurance coverage. That's a great path. What we did, with Prop 122 is we created the other path, a state-regulated therapeutic model that allows any adult, to sort of go in and have access to psilocybin, to psilocybin-based services for really any reason. It could be, human optimization, it could be growth, but it doesn't have to be medicalized. So that's like the key factor of our path. And our path involves sort of like natural psychedelics. And then, there's also a decriminalization, sort of intergenerational wisdom path as well, that our model provides for, and sort of like an individual, self-agency use. So your big picture, Prop 122 passing is sort of like a key piece of this overall strategy of how do we provide access to natural psychedelic medicines to those who need it in ways that meet them. And we'll dive in more of like the specifics of this later. But I will say, there was more psychedelics on the ballot in Oregon. A lot of communities in Oregon opted out of, of permitting psilocybin service centers in their communities. There was a couple communities that didn't opt out. This was sort of expected. What we did see is that those communities where there's public education about the benefits of psilocybin services, those communities did opt in. And so, big picture there with Oregon is, they're gearing up to start to accept applications for licensure for psilocybin service centers, product manufacturers, cultivators, et cetera, starting January 3rd, I believe, and so we have a team that's working on those. And, if you have any questions, definitely hit us up. But, big picture is, Colorado has proven that we can create a state-based access model. And I'll pass things back to you, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Josh. All right, let's talk a little bit about the federal elections. So what does any change in control mean for cannabis reform going forward? So the first question is are Republicans going to take the House? I think based upon what we know so far, that's probably a little bit more likely than not. Although hasn't been determined exactly, and if it is, it's going to be a really tight control. So let's talk a little bit about who I would say is the most senior House Republican proponent of cannabis reform, and that's David Joyce out of Ohio. He at least in this legislative session, he's on the House Appropriations Committee, which is pretty significant. And he's a ranking member of the Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies Committees. He's also on some other committees as well. And he was elected chairman of the Republican Governance Group, which is a caucus of moderate House Republicans. Now, the real question that we have is who's going to hold sway? Which of the Republicans are going to hold power? And are they at all going to be interested in cannabis reform, right? We do have some Republican House members. Joyce, we have Representative Nancy Mace, who's a lot more junior in South Carolina. These tend to be moderate Republicans that are seen as bipartisan. Whether or not the Republican House would like to be bipartisan, I think in some ways determines what they think they want to get done, right? Do they want to try to put forward and pass legislation? That might be difficult if they don't control the Senate. If they do control the Senate and the House, they may be able to pass certain legislation and then force Biden to either veto it or approve it. And given that they may have a very tight House majority, that could push bipartisanship. If maybe they only hold the House, I would imagine their interests are going to be in a combination of relitigating the 2020 election and, putting Joe Biden's son in the news every single day and running hearings against combination of Dr. Fauci and of Hunter Biden. So we could just see a cluster. But this is really going to depend on what faction holds sway, right? If Kevin McCarthy is to be elected Speaker of the House, is he relying on more moderate Republicans like David Joyce, or is he having to acquiesce to the further right side of his caucus in Marjorie Taylor Greene, and hopefully Lauren Boebert loses? That is still yet to be determined in Colorado on the western slope. So I think this is really what we have here, right? There are some Republican sponsors. So there's the Prepare Act, which David Joyce has introduced in the House, and that former governor, now Senator Hickenlooper, recently introduced in the Senate, which kind of clears the way, does some studies, puts together some working groups for federal regulatory reform at the for agencies to essentially allow people to understand what will be needed for federal legalization. And Representative Joyce has also been a proponent of a number of other cannabis reform and legalization measures. So this is really kind of what this means. We're not really quite sure. And we don't even know who's going to take the House. But I imagine, sadly, for the right side of the Republican Party is going to be those that are in power, as really that's where the focus is. And the fight between Trump and DeSantis will be fought in future years. Well, maybe it's going to start in a few months, which doesn't make me happy. Next slide, please. Thanks, Jen. Now, let's talk about, okay, we can prognosticate in the future, but let's talk about now, right? Because we are now officially in the lame duck session. So this is the roughly 2 months, November and December, until from the election until about January 3rd of 2023, which is when the next federal legislature is supposed to start. And I think we're going to be predominantly going to be focusing on what we've talked about, pass Safe Banking Plus. So this is the Safe Banking, either amendment or bill. It's been introduced in a number of different forms, plus some social equity, expungement, and others. So we're adding in restorative justice provisions. That's really been pushed by Cory Booker, and is how we've gotten the Senate to at least sign on to push it, rather than their own full comprehensive bill, at least in the immediate. The Senate will, though, still remain the primary challenge, right? We don't have 60 votes in the Senate to pass legalization. Do we have 60 votes in the Senate to pass Safe Banking Plus? We probably have closer than that, but that's kind of yet to be seen, because there's a number of Republicans that we would need. Right now, Democrats only have 50 votes in the Senate, so they would need 60 votes to get over that filibuster. And that is going to be the difficulty, right? We've heard Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer talk about conversations with his Republican counterparts. We know there are a handful of Republicans that are likely would sign on for Safe Banking Plus, but you need 2 handfuls to get past that 60. And so, Cory Booker said, I think there's a good chance. Republican allies also understand that if one of the houses of Congress shift to Republicans, it's going to be very hard to get done anything on marijuana. That assumes they want to get something done on cannabis. And again, there's probably half a dozen who definitely want to get something done, but are there kind of that full dozen we may actually need to pass Safe Banking Plus? I'm not someone who necessarily bet in favor of anything passing in the lame duck session. So even if we don't, Shane Pennington will talk in greater detail about what will be rolling out regardless of legislative gridlock in 2023 on the executive schedule. Cool. Thank you so much.
All right. So October 6th, President Biden kind of shocked everyone, or I guess everyone except maybe 10 people in the world, by declaring federal cannabis prohibition a failed approach. And he said it was a failed approach because it was putting people in jail, in prison, for cannabis use and possession. And so he had a 3-part initiative that he said he was going to implement to address this problem. It included pardons of federal simple possession offenses, of which there were, I think, 6,500 of those. Then he also urged the governors of the states to follow suit with respect to simple possession and use convictions under state law. And finally, and what we're going to be talking about now is he called on the Secretary of Health and Human Services and the Attorney General to initiate the administrative process to review cannabis's Schedule 1 status. And he also said that he hopes that they will do that expeditiously. And so that got changed my work life significantly from that point forward. And so we're going to be talking about what that process will look like. And before we get into it, I want to just explain right off the top that it's a very, very complicated and nuanced and somewhat dry process. I mean, this is like administrative process. Okay, so I'm only going to be hitting the highlights and things that I'm not going to be covering. You know, I'm happy to answer questions about if there's time, but I'm not going to be covering the nuances of the treaty considerations, even though that's something that I rant and rave about at length to anyone who's willing to listen. So if anybody has questions, I'm happy to, but I'm going to leave that alone. I'm also going to leave alone some of the real detail about how the scientific analysis will go inside the executive agencies. And so with that, let's get started on what we will cover, which is the administrative process, how long we might expect it to take, and what sort of results we might see and what the implications of those results might be for stakeholders. So starting with the administrative process, step one that you need to understand is that this is all going to be controlled by the Controlled Substances Act, a statute signed by Richard Nixon in 1970 that lays out in one particular section the way that drugs can be scheduled, rescheduled, or descheduled. And just to explain the distinction there, rescheduling is where a substance is moved from one schedule to a different schedule on the Controlled Substances Act lists. Descheduling is where a substance is moved from a schedule on the lists completely off of the schedules entirely. But before you get to how the process works, you have to figure out which process you're under. And there are two that are applicable here under the statute. The way that you tell which one you're under is whether the substance that you're talking about is controlled by one of these particular treaties that the statute mentions. And it turns out that cannabis is subject to control under a treaty. It's the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961. The statute says if control is required by the Single Convention, you got to go straight to 811D, which is the process that applies there. And where that's so, the Attorney General is supposed to issue an order deeming the placing the drug in the schedule that he deems, quote, most appropriate to ensure U.S. compliance with treaty obligations. And so if the Attorney General follows that statutory mandate, then the process will be very short indeed, and there will be nothing much to see here because for years and years, the DEA has said that treaty compliance, and this is not just the DEA, but the Department of State and others have uniformly said that treaty compliance requires being in Schedule 1 or Schedule 2. And so if they were to go that direction, they would just place cannabis in Schedule, probably keep it in Schedule 1, and just say, yeah, the treaty requires it, and write a short form letter and tell the president, I guess, to go pound sand or figure something else out. There's every reason to think that's not going to happen, though, and that we're instead going to be going down the other path, the other process that the statute permits. The main reason, I won't get into all of it, but the main reason that I think that that's so is because the president told Secretary Becerra to initiate this process. He said, he's requesting that the Attorney General and Secretary Becerra initiate the process. Well, as I just said, if we were going down the treaty route, Secretary Becerra wouldn't be involved at all. Whereas in the process that I think is going to happen and that everyone I think expects them to undertake, Secretary Becerra and HHS will play a major role. And that is the formal rulemaking process under sections 811A through C of the Controlled Substances Act. Okay, so let's head to the next slide. So I got Justice Thomas there and the Yeti. And why do I have them there? Well, this process called formal rulemaking, you're going to hear, if you read, what people are saying about this out there in the, Twitter sphere or whatever, a lot of people are saying, well, it's going to be a notice and comment process. And that's inaccurate. Notice and comment is informal rulemaking. The reason people think that's what it's going to be is because notice and comment is part of it, but it's only a very small part. And the other reason they think that is because informal rulemaking and notice and comment is, what we usually see, is almost entirely how agencies do things these days at the federal level. So it's normal for people to sort of assume that it would be notice and comment, but in fact, the statute requires formal rulemaking on the record, which is extraordinarily rare in federal law. And the reason it's rare is because it takes forever and it's inordinately complex. So where it applies, almost everywhere that it applies in the US Code, Congress has gone, back behind and changed it because it's ridiculous. There's one famous example where the FDA was trying to figure out how much peanut material has to be in a material before you can call it peanut butter. And it took them, I think, like 37 years or something ridiculous to figure that out through formal rulemaking. Justice Thomas is here because he recently said in a case that formal rulemaking is so rare, it's the Yeti of administrative law. You've heard tales that it exists, but no one has ever seen it in the wild. Well, we're about to see it in the wild. So next slide. Okay, so I'm just going to go over the process really quickly at a very high level, and then I'm going to tell you what actually matters. Okay, so the process breaks down into these different steps at a high level. Okay, there's before they initiate proceedings, what's going to happen is DEA is going to, quote, gather the necessary data. The necessary data is probably going to be the same stuff they've always looked at when they do a scheduling review, which is going to be like 11 studies that DEA has picked for whatever reasons it has, and those 11 studies are the ones that it counts and it looks at when it goes through this process, and it presumably will gather those. It will not gather state level data. You might think it would, because you might think that state level data would be relevant to figuring out whether cannabis has an abuse potential, what its abuse potential is relative to other substances, whether it has a currently accepted medical use. All of that would seem reasonable to me, but in fact, the DEA says and FDA agrees that state level data is categorically irrelevant to this process, so they will not be gathering that. What will happen is they'll gather these studies that they've used before, and then they will request two things from HHS. The first is an evaluation of cannabis's medical and scientific characteristics, and the second is a recommendation, or a scheduling recommendation. And this is extremely important, okay, because HHS, what will happen is HHS will send that request that it gets from DEA to the controlled substances staff at FDA. And the controlled substances staff is within this bigger office in FDA called the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, CEDAR, okay? So this little group of people, I forget how many there are, like 10 to 15, I can't remember exactly, but this staff are the people who make this recommendation. And it's extremely important. In fact, it's probably going to determine the entire outcome here. And here's why. The statute says that if HHS, which is this controlled substances staff, recommends no control, in other words, if they recommend descheduling, it's game, set, match. DEA cannot control the substance. So if FDA at this point in the process, this very beginning step, were to say, we recommend that you not control cannabis, that would be the entire process right there. Now, they would go through the motions on the rest of it, but that would end it, okay? It's also important because if this group were to recommend, say, Schedule 3, for example, then DEA can't go more restrictive than that, okay? It's bound, it's stuck at the level that HHS, it could go less restrictive if it wanted, but it can't go more restrictive than that. And the third reason that it's super duper important is because HHS's scientific and medical conclusions and determinations in these evaluations bind DEA in the process. So they cannot overrule FDA on anything science or medical related. And when I keep saying HHS and FDA, they're interchangeable here because HHS has delegated all this authority to FDA. So this first step in the process, which is going on presumably right now, by the way, like we're not going to know when it starts. It's probably already started. That is extremely important. Everything that happens after that, is I guess for building a record for judicial review and certain other, limited purposes, but it's not going to DEA's hands are tied if FDA, recommends descheduling. And for a number of reasons that are complex, but, that I won't go into great detail, but people generally think that descheduling is the best option here, right? And that, if you stay in the schedules, it's still criminalized, and that would be problematic. And so if you want to get descheduling, your best bet is to get FDA to recommend it here, because there's very little chance one would think that DEA would be like, you know what, FDA, we disagree with you. We think that cannabis should be less restricted than you do. Like that would be anomalous, and I wouldn't hold your breath. So this is the important part in the process right here. After that, what will happen is if once DEA gets this recommendation and evaluation back from HHS, it will look at that and it'll decide whether it, thinks that there needs to be proceedings to change cannabis's schedule. And if so, it'll propose a rule. Okay, and that's the first thing the public will probably see, is this proposed rule that will appear in the Federal Register, and it'll say we're proposing to reschedule to Schedule 2, 3, 4, 5, or deschedule. Okay, then they'll, in that Federal Register publication, they'll say we'd like to have comments from the public on this, and that would give you a chance to weigh in on it, you or anybody else. And also they'll allow, quote, interested persons, unquote, to request hearings. These hearings are on the record hearings. It's like a trial. You'd be able to put in evidence, you'd be able to cross-examine, witnesses. There would be the full-blown trial-like procedures before an administrative law judge. And then you would have, objections and the whole thing, just like in a courtroom. And the ALJ would rule on all the objections, make findings and conclusions of law. Those would go to the administrator of DEA. And the administrator of DEA would get all of this information, the ALJ record, the public comments, all of this, and will issue a final order on cannabis's scheduling at that point. And so that's kind of an overview of the process. And the important takeaway here is that there's going to be all of this opportunity for public participation, et cetera. But the real, where's the beef? It's at the very beginning before you even know what's going on. All right. Back in the, halls of some agency that we're never going to see. So let's go to the next slide. A lot of folks want to know, what the timeline is here. And it's going to be a very, very long time. Generally, the average time that it takes to go through the formal rulemaking process at DEA is 9.5 years. The president said that he wanted to do it expeditiously. I guess technically they could do it as fast as they, want. There's nothing to stop them. But, generally speaking, it takes a long time. I mean, the first time they did, they ruled on a rescheduling petition for cannabis, it took 22 years. So buckle up. It's going to be a long ride. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I can send anybody who wants it this chart, all right, because there's a lot of misinformation out there, and so I tried to put it all in one place. I'm obviously not going to go over all of this, but there is a way to figure out what the different schedules mean, right? And this is it. And basically, it's complicated, and there's a lot to it. And in fact, this is this chart has everything, but in fact, it's more complicated than this, because DEA sometimes puts something in a schedule and then adds specific regulations to particular substances. It did this with Epidiolex, for example. It said, look, the treaties require us to put cannabis in Schedule 1 or Schedule 2, but we're going to put it in Schedule 5, and we're going to add regulations to it to ensure treaty compliance. And so it was in Schedule 5 technically, but it was treated like a Schedule 1 or 2 substance in various very important ways. And then the 2018 Farm Bill came and they're like, oh, never mind, it's descheduled. So there you go. Let's go to the next slide, because I'm going to try to hit the important points here. So results and implications. These are the things I get asked most often. And so I'm just going to answer them here, just, straight away. What schedule would solve the 280E problem? Schedule 3. A common follow-up question is, well, isn't OxyContin a Schedule 2 substance, and yet Purdue Pharma sells it without having to abide by 280E? How does that work? And the reason is because, unlike cannabis, OxyContin is an FDA-approved medicine. And so while it might, cause rampant addiction and all sorts of problems for people. It also is a safe and effective medication according to FDA for many different indications. Therefore, it is in Schedule 2, and when you sell it, you're not trafficking in that Schedule 2 substance. So you're allowed, you avoid 280E as long as you're not trafficking. And this is important, even if you moved cannabis to Schedule 2, if it's not FDA approved, which it's not, then you would still be trafficking in it were you to sell it as medicine interstate without FDA approval. So you wouldn't be able to get around 280E that way, but you would be able to get around it if it were in Schedule 3. And to Jacqueline, I see cocaine in Schedule 2, you're correct. And it's a great example. If you sell cocaine, you're trafficking. So don't try to get around 280E when you're selling coke, right? Like, not going to work. The fact that it's in Schedule 2 doesn't help you there. But if you're Purdue Pharma and you actually spent the billions of dollars to put cocaine through the FDA approval process, right, then you'd be good, right? And so see Adderall and Vyvanse and et cetera. I know they're not the same, but as someone who takes one of those, I think that there is some similarity there. What schedule would accomplish the president's goal of ensuring no one goes to jail for cannabis use? And this is a hugely important, and like I can't believe everybody's overlooking this, but the president said nobody should be going to jail for cannabis use. Well, that's as good as saying deschedule it. Because if cannabis is on Schedule 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, possession, is criminalized. I mean, look at, if you want to see what I'm talking about, look at 21 USC 829 D, I think it is. It's C or D, where it says Schedule 5 substances may not be dispensed or distributed for anything other than medical uses. And remember, medical use means FDA approved medical use. They don't care what the state says. Okay. So if you're taking a Schedule 5 substance, think of like codeine cough syrup, right? And you're doing that for non-medical reasons, then you could go to jail for that, under 21 USC 844 and the criminal provisions of the Controlled Substances Act. Hugely significant because it shows that the only way to do what the president said, cure the failed approach to cannabis, would be to deschedule it. And I think that people, especially Republicans in Congress, need to, somebody needs to send a messenger over there and let them know that. That's the only way to accomplish that goal. Okay, this is the next thing I get. People don't really ask me this, they just tell me this, and then I argue with them a lot. So now you don't get to argue back, at least not until the Q&A time. So I'm gonna just tell you what I say to this. Would Schedule 2 be better or worse than the status quo? I hear all the time that Schedule 2, rescheduling cannabis from 1 to 2 would cause this, apocalyptic meltdown in the cannabis industry where FDA would, they're like, DEA would be raiding everybody's dispensaries and just kicking down doors, and people would be going to jail, and the industry would just, sink to the depths of the earth or something. And the reason for this that people say is that it would, impose a pharma model onto cannabis. Well, I've got news for everybody. You're in the pharma model now. Schedule 1 is far more restrictive than Schedule 2. The FDCA doesn't suddenly not apply anymore just because you're in Schedule 1, right? Like, it applies all the time, and it applies regardless of scheduling. And here's the other thing. It would apply even if you were off the schedules. So even if you descheduled cannabis, you would still be subject to the pharmaceutical model and the FDCA. In fact, most approved drugs aren't controlled substances. That doesn't mean that those substances don't have to, abide by the FDCA. The reason that there's no enforcement now is because of enforcement discretion policies that recognize that it would be practically impossible for the federal government to enforce against cannabis. And that will be true regardless of what happens with this administrative scheduling process. Last, what would descheduling mean for efforts to reform federal psychedelics policy? Well, because the standards that apply to cannabis apply to all substances, and because the agencies would have to change their interpretations of the Controlled Substances Act in order to reschedule or deschedule cannabis, the changes that they make would apply across the board to all controlled substances, including MDMA, psilocybin, peyote, mescaline, on and on and on, right? So what happens here does not stay here, okay? This will apply across the board, whatever happens. And that's important both for us to understand what it means. It's also going to be very important to the agencies who are undertaking the process. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Shane. We've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to go really quickly. All right, let's talk a little bit about legislative policy. So as I mentioned early on, Minnesota, we now have a Democratic trifecta as the Democratic Farmer Labor, which is the Democratic Party in Minnesota, took the Senate as well. The Democratic House in the past had passed legalization in 2021, but Republicans killed the measure in 2021 and 2022. That being said, it's probably going to be on the docket for real consideration. And speaking with some of our colleagues, Jason Tarasek, and I was on a webinar yesterday with Ryan Winkler, who's the Speaker of the House in Minnesota. It's going to be hopefully a priority. And so Senator Aaron Murphy, who may be the next majority leader in the Senate, said that they're going to get it together for the first time tomorrow and talk about the agenda. And it's important to remember that cannabis is overwhelmingly popular. Further, the governor, the Democratic governor, who's supportive of legalization, won his reelection. So Minnesota might be on for 2023. Let's go to the next slide. All right, let's talk about Hawaii. So Hawaii is actually back. I think it was last session and the session before, they created a, quote, dual use cannabis task force to explore what legalization policy would look like and what that might look like for adult use for both the medical program and for adult use for tourism. Current governor David Ige wasn't really in favor of cannabis reform and kind of told the Democrats to not really push this forward. But new Governor Josh Green said he would sign a legalization bill. 73% of Hawaii residents support legalization. And I spent quite a bit of time yesterday looking through the Hawaii MPP voter guide. And then also who won. So in the Senate, I think it's pretty likely. 15 of the 25 said that they were in favor of cannabis legalization and were indicated as green. They won. And in the House, there's a lot of unknowns. Some of those in the House had voted previously on decriminalization. Some of them are new. So this will really be whether or not we see legalization in Hawaii. Hawaii was actually the first state in the to pass medical marijuana through its legislature in 2000, and maybe one of the newer next states to pass legalization through its legislature. So we'll see there, and would really induce me to go on a Hawaii vacation. All right, let's hand it over to Yolanda as we talk about the state ballot measures.
Great, thanks, Andrew. As if we needed more reasons to go down to Hawaii, right? So moving here, we're going to talk about some of the state measures that were on the ballot this time around. So just to start us off, as Andrew alluded to at the top of the webinar, unfortunately, there were 3 measures that did not pass. This is Arkansas and North and South Dakota. While obviously this is a disappointment, I really don't want us to lose focus on the bigger picture. Each of these initiatives, while it would have been, wonderful to pass, they all had some pretty interesting setups for how the system was going to work, and were very protectionist. A lot of these would, if they had passed, they would have provided opportunities for the existing operators, but not really for any new operators. So, while we always hate to see any of these legalization measures not pass, there is still a lot of room and opportunity for, the next legislative sessions and for upcoming elections to pass bills that will create a more functioning system and also provide better business opportunities for those that are not in the system. With that, though, we get to turn to some positive news with this Maryland. If you saw our first webinar before the election last week, Maryland was one that we had very high probability of passing, and it did. And this map is just one of my favorites, because if you can see, almost every single county in the state of Maryland voted to approve legalization. And this is really notable because, for those of you not familiar, these western portions of the state, as well as the eastern portion, generally do run more conservative. These are the more agricultural areas. So the fact that, there was a sole holdout to not approve legalization is just really gratifying to see. Next slide, Andrew, thanks. So what does this do? So this is a little bit interesting because, as Andrew alluded to, this was a legislatively referred constitutional amendment. So basically, as it stands right now, this has been added to the Maryland Constitution, and there's a complementary implementation bill. This is HB 837 that outlines what specifically this actually means. So now in Maryland, although there is a protracted timeline, we're going to talk about that in the next just a minute here, legalizes the purchase and possession up to 1.5 ounces for adults, removes criminal penalties for up to 2.5 ounces, permits home cultivation. There's automatic expungement provisions. And then there's also a petition process for certain other convictions that are not eligible for automatic expungement. Most important, though, for those interested in business opportunities are the licensing and regulatory components, which are to be determined. Next slide, Andrew. So this is kind of what we're talking about here with the timeline. So while this did pass, on Tuesday, the actual implementation for some of these reduced criminal penalties is a little bit protracted. So January 1st is when possession becomes a civil offense, and legalization does not fully in control. Sorry, we had the comments here. Legalization does not go fully into effect until June 1. What really you're going to want to be paying attention to are the working groups at the Maryland legislature. Next slide. So this working group has already been meeting throughout the last legislative session, and as they prepared for the election on November 8th to talk about what they wanted to see. They're looking at other areas that have legalized, including so many recently on the East Coast. So what the actual business structure in the state is, and what the opportunities are going to be is really going to be dependent on what the working group comes up with and what passes in the legislature in 2023. Something that you should definitely be aware of is a super strong focus on social equity provisions. This is something that has already been a focus for the commission for the medical side of things. The most recent application in 2018 was completely revamped to put a greater focus on social equity provision, and we can absolutely anticipate that that will continue as the adult use market expands. I have this quote here from Delegate Wilson, who's a co-chair on the task force, that says explicitly, in 5 or 10 years, if we don't have a 30% minority participation in the market of Maryland, then they have failed as a General Assembly. So, it's pretty strong words. We're going to see exactly how that plays out, but you're going to anticipate that you're going to not only need to show control of the entity and day-to-day operations, but also equity in the entity. Here we just have a general snapshot for what the state looks like. It's just about 6 million people, a little under 1 million cannabis consumers, a little under 200,000 current medical patients. And just under 40 million in dispensary sales for the medical market. Andrew, I don't know if you want to pop in here real quick to talk about some of the anticipated market value.
Yeah, that's just looking specifically at resident consumers, so those who are residents of Maryland, assuming that they would purchase cannabis based upon their use rates at kind of $200 an ounce as an analog for all cannabis consumption. We'd probably be looking at about $1.5 billion market. Now, of course, Maryland, as we've seen Virginia hasn't really moved forward with its legalization as quickly. So we could obviously see a lot of regional demand come in from border states in the ways that happened with Massachusetts. So I would say it's probably going to be significantly higher than 1.5, but that's kind of the resident potential. Wonderful.
All right, and that brings us to our next state, which is Missouri, also voting yes for legalization. This one, you can go to next slide here. So the bill, or the amendment, will go into effect in December. Just like Maryland, this is a constitutional amendment. So but unlike Maryland, this is a lot more robust in what was in the amendment itself. So unlike Maryland, where most of this is kind of to be determined in the legislature, what it's going to look like, Missouri has really gone ahead and enshrined all of these things now in their constitution. So what are we going to see? It's going to legalize possession, purchase, and home cultivation, as well as commercial production and sale. There are expungement provisions, although those largely need to be petitioned for as opposed to automatic expungements. Something new for Missouri is a chief equity officer position. So while we had talked about in Maryland how social equity is going to be a real focus, they are also bringing social equity into focus in Missouri as well. There's going to be annual reporting and big strides as the market progresses to increase the equity in the state. Taxes are also laid out in the amendment. Next slide. So what are the licensing opportunities here? So important to know is there are kind of two different pathways. One are comprehensive facilities, and then the other is the micro business facilities. So the comprehensive facilities are kind of the more traditional, you have your cultivators, processors, dispensaries on a normal scale. Micro business are designed specifically for social equity applicants and are much smaller. So we have here limited to 250 plants. They are actually completely separate supply chains. So that's going to be something important to note, that you can't cross supply chains. If you're a micro business dispensary, you cannot get your product from the comprehensive facility market, vice versa. Next slide. So as I mentioned, these micro businesses are social equity focused. So they have to be majority owned by individuals who meet these certain qualifications, annual income statements, residing in certain zip codes, graduating from unaccredited school districts. These are things that we've seen more and more over the years as additional states have legalized, trying to kind of get parity and increase the minority ownership for these entities. What are the next steps? So this is a kind of an interesting system as well. As we've seen in many other states, the existing medical operators are going to be able to convert. And really for the first year and a half, that's going to be the main opportunity is for those who are already in the Missouri system. So as soon as this goes into effect in December, existing medical operators are going to be able to apply to the department in order to open up these comprehensive facilities and run adult use stores, cultivation, processing facilities. The department has to approve those applications within 60 days. Meanwhile, while that's going on, within 180 days, the department is going to be working to get forms together and instructions for this new license type, which is these micro business facilities. And within 270 days, so approximately September of 2023, they're going to start accepting the micro business applications. There are minimum numbers that are split up by congressional district, which those of you who are part of the Missouri market will know is a mimic of the medical system. After a year and a half, which is 548 days, the department can choose to open up a lottery process for new comprehensive marijuana licenses that are not already existing medical operators. Important to note here that this will require some either change in the legislature or change in the rules in order to actually hold this lottery for the non-medical license holders. So that's going to be something really important to watch in Missouri as the system progresses. The department also has the ability to create some new license types. So we're anticipating we're going to see some transportation, delivery, and research license types that could also provide some opportunities for individuals. Here we just have an overview of the Missouri market. Again, just about 6 million individuals in the state, comparable number of adult consumers as well as medical patients. So another one to take a look at if you're interested in getting involved. And last, I just want to talk about, what can you do if you are interested in either of these markets? What can you do to be preparing? So first is real estate. We're seeing more and more the property game is what's becoming a big hurdle, whether that's because of zoning or localities opting out. The sooner that you can lock down a compliant property, the better position you're going to be in. You also want to make sure you're building a team. While we are seeing, some less competitive applications, and by that I mean that they're not quite as limited in the numbers that they're handing out, and they're awarded via a lottery as opposed to comprehensive scoring. It is still very important to have a real level of expertise on your team. So that's something that you should be developing. And then the last is really probably the most important at this juncture, which is getting involved in the regulatory process. There's going to be rulemaking in both of these states. The legislature is going to be working to pass new bills. So to the extent that you can be involved, submit public comments, talk to your legislators about what you want to see, now is the time to do that, and you can really impact what the system is going to look like and what the business opportunities will be and how successful the adult market will be in your states.
Awesome.
Great. Thanks so much, Yolanda. Josh, you want to jump in on the 122?
Yeah, we're negative 1 minute, so I'll keep things quick.
Apologies.
Short story, is that there's a lot of opportunity, under Prop 122. There's a regulated model, that will be developed over the next 18 months. And there's also a decrim personal use model that provides a lot of leeway to, it provides a lot of leeway for folks to cultivate and to share, but not for the commercialization, with a couple exceptions. But if you go to the next slide, here's where we are. It's Prop 122. Hopefully it'll be officially called here at some point, but it'll be most likely 30 days from now, when the election will actually be certified. It'll go into effect. The decrim provisions will go into effect, and then the regulatory process will start with the first timeline being this advisory board. There's appointments to be made by January 31st, from the governor's office with the consent of the Senate. There needs to be members that have experience in these different areas. If people are interested in applying, we should definitely talk about that. Ultimately, like the process, what does this look like? It will be decided by the governor's office, and I have a lot of faith in their, both their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and their, commitment to good governance. That they will create a good process around this. But that's the first step, is the advisory board. And then if you go to the next slide, you can sort of see the timeline. It's like the advisory board's got to get to work. There's a year to make rules, or a little less than a year to make rules for facilitator trainings. For those who aren't familiar, the measure creates a new career profession under DORA, the sort of licensed, facilitator or psychedelic facilitator. And there needs to be developed both like training programs and curriculum, and sort of standards of what does it mean to be a state licensed psychedelic facilitator in Colorado. And then you'll see, it's like, then after that, the idea is like we need those programs set up first, so we can start training facilitators, with hopefully healing centers, ready to go, or at least the regulations around them ready to go September 2024. And then, there's a timeline for accepting applications on those. And then, at some point in 2026, that we can add other natural medicines to the regulated model. Something definitely to be discussed another day. Can we go to the next slide? A couple things to think about, through this process is, one, a lot of the details of what this looks like will come in through the implementation process. But there's a mandate around equity, around equitable access, around diversity and equity and ownership. Those details will be mandated, will not be mandated, but fleshed out in the regulatory process. Same with this first of its kind ESG screen around corporate participation. And that whole purpose is, how do we mandate that companies that participate have business practices that sort of match our values as a state, and also don't engage in extractive or predatory business practices. But so big things around implementation that'll come out. A couple things to watch, though, is legislatively we might see some changes. We might, there might be some changes about who's going to be involved, what regulatory agencies are going to be involved. There's talk of maybe splitting, having the healing centers licensed by a different entity besides DORA. We'll also see a lot of local government work. Each local government has a time, place, manner restriction, or not restriction. They have the ability to regulate time, place, and manner. And so we'll see a lot of local governments picking this up and, trying to understand how they want to zone it. We'll also see a lot of work around public education, both educating like first multi-level responders and law enforcement and the public about what does this decrim mean. So these are some of the hot topics. I already mentioned, some of the facilitator trainings. These are some of the hot topics that watch out for. And we'll definitely do another webinar, sort of like really diving in deep on Prop 122. For those who are interested in being involved in the process, definitely reach out to me. I'd love to chat. Meanwhile, too, for those who are looking at Oregon, Oregon's another another opportunity for a lot of companies. That is kicking off in a couple months here. So reach out to us about that as well. But that's what we got.
Thank you so much, Josh. Thank you, Yolanda. Thank you, Shane. I know we are over. We've helped to answer a number of questions in the chat. But if you still have them, feel free to send them forward, and we'll do our best to provide some of those answers. I'm looking at it now. I think pretty much all of them were answered. There's one that looks like, what does this look like for social equity for the wellness centers? I'm not sure whether or not that was for 122 or for any of the cannabis. On social equity, at least on the cannabis side of things, as Yolanda mentioned, going to be a real priority for Maryland. Maybe less of a priority, although it will be to some extent for Missouri. But it is important to note, as Yolanda said, that the micro businesses there are actually a separate track. And so most of the business action is going to be happening with the comprehensive facilities for those existing operators. Thank you all so much. I know we went long today, but I hope this long webinar provided a ton of helpful and useful information. If you have any questions on state cannabis ballots, if you got any questions on implementation, if you have questions on executive scheduling reform, what is this going to look like for your business, and how you may participate in this executive scheduling process, or if you want to know about what it's going to take to start a psilocybin and psychedelic natural medicine business in Colorado, please reach out to our office. We are here to help you start your business, grow your business, and expand in any ways you need. Thank you so much. I hope everyone had a wonderful day today, and I look forward to working with you all in the future.